I'm not sure about the life stages, except for, like I said, it's like over time, if you've been betrayed a lot, then yeah, by the time you get your middle age, you're just like that. Everybody sucks. Welcome to the Simply Human YouTube channel and podcast. I'm Christina Caro, licensed clinical psychologist.
And I'm Karen Linsky, leadership and self-trust coach.
So welcome back to the channel. And today we are continuing our exploration of meaningful connection through the lens of trust. Now, I want y'all to stop and think for a moment. Are you someone who leans towards caution, like withholding trust until a person earns it through consistent trust-earning behavior? Or are you someone who tends to give your trust freely, but it is a gift and it's the person's to lose through untrustworthy behavior? So these are the two ends of the trust spectrum that we intend to explore today. What are the strengths and challenges of each? And what should we consider when reflecting on whether that trust approach that we lean towards, is it working for us?
So before we actually start, consider giving us a thumbs up. And if you'd like to help us reach more people, it'd be great if you would consider subscribing and sharing it with 1, 2, or even more of your friends. That'd be really great. So let me start by defining that trust must be earned, that perspective. Some people, like you said earlier, take a more cautious path when it comes to trust. It's not that they don't want connection. It's just that they need to see the consistency first, because trust for them is something you build, not something that you hand out on day one. And so usually that mindset comes from an experience that they had. Maybe they've been let down before over and over again. And so now they move much more slower in relationship to relationships. So they start smaller, right? They're watching how you respond, how you show up, how you follow through before they really open up. And the reason why they do it is because it's a way of protecting themselves. And it's also how they create deep, lasting relationships, because they know. Once they know, because you've earned it. And sure, it will take a little longer to get close, but that's what's the cool part. Because once you're in, I think it's harder to break their trust, right? Mm-hmm. Because you're really in. Because for them, that you've done all that stuff, so the trust is really earned.
You know, Karen, as you're describing that, I'm just remembering that this is actually a difference that I have experienced from living on the East Coast and living on the West Coast.
Oh,
is
interesting.
The East Coast, it was pretty consistent to be that longer ramp up. And that's where all of my friends of 30, 35 years for the most part are. And then since I've come back to California, where people kind of make friends really quickly, but they don't have that endurance. It just occurred to me when you're—
that's interesting. Yeah. So we're going to be covering that a little bit because it could be situational, right? And that's so interesting about the coast. It's cool.
Yeah, that's interesting. So let me describe the trust is freely given perspective. And this is a core difference between the two, which is rather than having that ramp up, is we just start off giving trust. And then if a person consistently is engaging in behavior that violates that trust, then we withdraw the goodie that was given. So it doesn't necessarily mean that there's not long-term relationships, because I'm actually this way. And Karen, I think you and I became friends pretty quickly. I mean, while several of my friendships had that style you described, there were also a couple that, we just became fast friends. Yeah, just clicked. And there wasn't that ramp up. And they've also ended up being these 30-year friendships. So we are going to be going into the pros and cons of each one, but we wanted to just lay out that difference between the ramp up earning through consistent behavior, or the giving trust and then losing it over consistent untrustworthy behavior.
So let me start by talking about the case for why trust must be earned. So what's interesting about why trust to be earned, the key arguments that people, like I know one of my clients are very much trust must be earned. And it's really against manipulation and betrayal. And I get that. Like in this too, like I understand that because he's been hurt so much before that it is allowing him to make sure against manipulation. And when you're not good with manipulation, once you are manipulated, you're like, oh, you kind of like go full out. It also encourages people, which I never thought about till we did this research, about encourages people to demonstrate the reliability. Because one of the key equations or elements of trustworthiness is reliability. And so I thought that was very interesting because you can count on them, right? You can count on them. They're in your corner. And then it also does create clear standards for your relationship building, that, you kind of know what you value. And then it does lead to more stronger because it's already been tested many times because you actually have those criteria from which you achieve.
Yeah, I think there's drawbacks, though. I mean, it's certainly understandable, especially what you said about if you've had past experience of betrayal, it's possible that you've developed this more cautious approach. But what are the potential drawbacks? So when you have that more cautious approach, it can create barriers to connection. And I was thinking about how this trust must be earned philosophy might be related to something that we've been hearing a lot more in the news, particularly since the pandemic. It was before the pandemic, we were starting to hear reports. There was a study that actually came out and was more on seniors on an epidemic of loneliness. But after the pandemic, this epidemic of loneliness was starting to be talked about younger people as well. Young people feel alienated and lonely. And I was thinking about, is there a relationship here? So back in the day when we probably developed this trust must be earned, we had a simpler life. People tended to live in the same town. They worked at the same job for a very long time. So you got to know your neighbors. So you had this context where you actually had the time to get to know people and build up those experiences that Karen you were just talking about and get to that point of long-term enduring relationships. But what we saw during the pandemic is when people were isolated from each other, so they're cut off from those experiences, or even prior to that our lives are much more complex now. People are often changing jobs up to 7 times. They're changing their jobs. They're moving to different cities in order to get that job just to make ends meet. You have 2-income families most of the time. You're running around taking your kids everywhere. And so we just find that we don't have the emotional bandwidth to invest in those long-term experiences. And so there is a part of me that I'm wondering, because there's a lot of research and curiosity right now. It's like, what is contributing to this epidemic of loneliness? And I did start to think, I wonder if this preference that people have without being reflective about their preference, if we just tend to automatically do it, it's somehow we're contributing to this epidemic of loneliness and we don't realize that. So I wanted to bring that up.
Interesting. I love that.
Yeah.
I would never thought that until you brought that up.
I just thought about this morning, so you and I didn't have a chance to talk about it. Now, there are some other potential drawbacks. So there's also the risk of missed opportunities because of that guardedness. You might have met that person on a whim and they become your longtime friend because you had a conversation in a coffee shop, but you're guarded so you don't reveal much so that connection doesn't happen. It can result in having an attitude of skepticism in general because of guardedness. And in the long term, we find that as a culture, we seem to be becoming more cynical and more unfriendly. Not only are we not trusting, if we're predisposed to this, trust must be earned. And there are interests out there who understand the psychology and are exploiting our tendency to be mistrusting and cautious, that we're getting fed information that says, don't trust other. You should be cautious. There's all this bad stuff happening. It causes us to withdraw. It causes us to be more suspicious. We entrench even more into the trust must be earned, but there's this skepticism now and there's this cynicism and ends up resulting in this unfriendliness as a nation, if you stop to think about
Yeah.
it, that we're starting to see.
Yeah, it's so interesting because I think we're learning now that to mitigate the trust must be earned drawbacks, it's really important that you have that balanced skepticism because you got to distinguish between healthy caution and then your paralyzing distrust. Right. And I think it's interesting because I never thought about the power of that to dwell on healthy caution and paralyzing distrust. Because I think for me, I tend to catastrophize in the past, not now. What I think is also interesting is that clear communications. So expressing your trust building process so that you don't become closed off, because I know that some people, it seems like you're being closed off because you're not, sharing as much. But if you explain it to them in a way that they understand as part of your process. Yeah. And also what I love about this too was about that small opportunities. If you focus on the small opportunities for people to build your trust, it's not like once and done, right? So it's not like, okay, they didn't do this, they really screwed up, but maybe it's just the circumstance or something. It wasn't all under their control. Instead of just realizing, okay, there's parts of it where they did really well. So that's the small opportunities for trust. And then there's the self-awareness, which is you recognize, and this is really important too, when you recognize that the past wounds are coloring your current interaction. The importance of that to understand is the situation of your past wounds isn't exactly the same situation as right now. So you can't always equate your past to your present and then automatically say he's distrustful because they're different people. Because we always talk about recognizing the person for their individualness. So as a result, it's really important that we don't color it because this person was this and then I equate them and I see them to be together. I don't see the individualness of that person. And then I love this whole point is the ability to let the evidence accumulate. So there's a regular reassessment, right? You're always reassessing. So the ability to accelerate that trust building when the positive evidence accumulates instead of having them like, okay, this distrust, then trust, and distrust, instead of looking, okay, he's building. Because there's always a little, maybe a step back, but you have to give them credit for the step forwards too. That's what I'm thinking too. And even expanding your risk tolerance, because in today's stressful culture, we really don't have the luxury of long, slow process, right? And we may have to increase our risk tolerance in order to be able to really begin to be more generous with our trust earlier in the relationships than otherwise.
Yeah. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later, about how do we expand risk tolerance and maybe finding a ground. So so thank you for that, Karen. Let's go into the case where the trust is freely given. So it does result in fostering more open and positive initial connections because people can sense whether or not you are closed off, keeping things close to the chest, guarded, and people have their own assumptions about that. Matter of fact, guardedness itself can be perceived by some as untrustworthy. That person is keeping something a secret, therefore they're not trustworthy. So when we are starting from a point of, you know what, I give my trust freely, it's yours to lose, you have a more open demeanor, and then that tends to foster more positive initial connections. It creates this environment of goodwill because the assumption is you are worthy of trust. And then it might inspire others to actually live up to your trust. And similar to what Karen said, when you share your philosophy, people will be like, possibly inspired to want to meet you in that way. And it does align with a more optimistic view of human nature, that human beings are basically good and kind, and it's the minority sort of on the bell curve that are not trustworthy, but that the majority of people, you can be pretty much trustworthy. And that's just an attitude that we have. And I think, Karen, you and I talked about this. I do lean automatically. This is my knee-jerk automatic philosophy and position. And for you, it is most of the time, correct?
Yeah, it's it is to freely give my trust. There are times when I think I hold back and I'm realizing some of my unconscious biases that might be holding me back from fully giving it. But my nature, I think, is to always give it freely.
Yeah, I also lean towards the giving trust freely. And, and I've certainly been challenged. Like my dad was appalled. He made the most interesting comment. He said, "Your trust is a gift. It must be earned." And I was like, that doesn't even make sense. Gifts are given. gifts are not earned. So that didn't make sense to me at all. But I think for me, being on the autistic spectrum, it is a challenge for me to go and be in the world with that suspicious, you have to earn my trust approach, because that feeling of I have to be guarded and now I have to be evaluating if what you're saying is truthful or are you being deceptive, or I have to keep track of it. It's exhausting because of my challenges with the interpersonal, social communication, social behaviors, all of that. And also because, for a lot of us on the spectrum, being deceptive doesn't even come naturally. So it doesn't even occur to me that someone's going to be deceptive. I've been, cautioned by, like I have many of my supervisors like, you're so naive, Christina. Blah, blah, blah. And especially if you're working with a population that I've worked with in substance abuse or who've had criminal histories, I would be told, Christina, you're too trusting and they're going to walk all over you and take advantage of you and blah, blah, blah. And it's so interesting as a therapist. I'm like, listen, if they're going to come into therapy and lie, who does it harm? It harms them because now they get no benefit out of therapy. So I didn't put those barriers up. And I would have to say that I think I have actually been pretty darn successful, because what happens is even in these challenging relationships, when people experience a non-judgmental interaction, I'm not prejudging you because of your past, and I'm open to who you are today, and you have my trust. It's yours to lose. There's a lot of people who realize what a gift that is, and it does inspire them.
I agree with you. I think I have more good experiences from giving trust out freely, because I agree with you. The fact is that when you give it out freely, people can feel that and they reciprocate.
Yeah.
Even to people who might not usually give out trust, I think it shortens, I believe with my client, because I gave out trust freely, it shortened the ramp for me to achieve his trust. I really do believe. One of the things I wanted to share was the potential drawbacks, but you already hit them, right? Everything, the one you already talked about, the potential drawbacks was there's that vulnerability to deception. You may be led to disappointment because then that person proves unworthy of your trust. I mean, you're like, but it's okay. And then there's the potential to being taken advantage of. And it's true, because what do we call them? Naive.
But I do think that there needs to be some mitigation of the downside.
I know. So let's talk about that.
Yeah, because I agree with you. I think on the whole, and I tend to do a lot in life with the 80-20 rule, you shoot for some intentional approach to 80%, and then, 20% you do mitigation and risk management. So 80% of the time, I would say that my experience and my approach has been really, really positive.
Me too.
Now, for the 20%, we can mitigate the damage from the times where it doesn't work out. And some of these strategies are something we've talked a lot about. The number one most important thing for mitigating the potential harm of this approach is boundary setting. So remember, this isn't that you give your trust freely and that's it. You never come back and reevaluate. The whole thing is you give your trust freely until consistent behavior says, okay, I gave this to you. You did not show yourself to be responsible with it. And now it's time to draw it back. And then really you swing over to the other side. If that person has to be in your life, now they have to earn it. And I'll tell you, I find that it's almost impossible to earn it back, because the fact was it was a gift that you treated badly. So the ramp up to try to re-earn that is much harder than for even the people who start off, you have to earn my trust. So, just for those of you out there who think I'm going to take advantage of someone who gives trust freely, just know, no, we're still watching. And if you lose it, you've most likely lost it forever. But we can still take some steps of boundary setting while we're extending that initial trust. It's like goodwill. Here's what's okay and what's not okay for me. You could be a little bit more progressive in disclosing. Like don't just share everything immediately and assume that person knows how to hold confidences. You can ask more questions and sort of test your assumptions about that person's capacity to hold that gift in a responsible way. So It's like trust with verification. You'll build an occasional check-in without undermining the relationship. We build resilience because there is that 20% where a person is going to let you down. And it seems like the place where the letdown happens is in the closest, most intimate relationships, where you start off and you're falling in love and you trust freely, and then that person over time loses your trust. So you have to build up your emotional resilience so you aren't wounded and scarred from those hard experiences. And then you might want to think about, does it make sense to give trust freely in more low risk areas while being more cautious in high stakes situations? So that would be mitigating the potential risk of it. So yes, I'm going to be more trustful with my neighbor who I know really well and wants to borrow my lawnmower, but I'm not going to be necessarily as openly trusting with someone I don't know who calls and says, hey, I got this as a therapist. Someone saying, I want to book some sessions and pay up in front to secure it. And I was like, no, I don't do that. So the whole thing was a scam. It was, I'm going to send you this money order, and it's a fraudulent money order. And then they'll write, I'm stuck in this place. Can you send me back some of that money? And
oh my gosh.
Oh, yeah. I had to take it to the police and everything like that. It was really sucky that they were targeting therapists because they know that we tend to be wanting to help and trusting. It is dumb, but yeah. So you're evaluating like, this seems risky to me. So that I trust and give it freely doesn't mean I'm not evaluating risk.
So Christina, I just want to go back to when you talked about trust verification, because I kept thinking about people can't read your mind, right? So someone does something that gives you a discomfort because they're reeling against your trust for them, right? And they can't read your mind. What's the best way to share that with them? Because you can't just go from trusting them to not trusting them, because I don't want to go that far. So talk a little bit more at that. What does the trust verification check-ins, how could it sound like?
So what we're talking about, right? So this is the philosophy where I give my trust freely and it's yours to lose. So Karen's asking, well, what happens when they start doing some behaviors that makes you start to go, that was not okay. Now, me, one of my autistic rules I just made for myself is I have a 3-strike rule.
Yeah. Okay.
So the first time it is, it's an accident, it's a misunderstanding. The second time, it's like, okay, we had a conversation about it, but everybody's human. You're not going to be perfect and you forget. But the third time, it's like, now I'm seeing a pattern. So, but what am I doing in between? In between is open communication. In between is sharing with that person, saying, listen, I was really trusting you with XYZ, and then this happened. Like, help me understand from your perspective. What was your intentions? I'm still extending the opportunity for the person. Maybe it is that misunderstanding. And if it was, now I can go back to that boundary setting. Okay, let me clarify for you why that is important, or that was a confidence, or that behavior is not okay with me, and it's going to undermine my trust in you. So I set those boundaries. I have that conversation again. So this is the trust with verification, is I'm trusting you, but things are happening. Let me have that conversation. Let's verify what is actually going on. Was that intentionally a trustworthy behavior and you just got caught? Or was it an accident and not understanding? And let me give you clear heads up. Hey, you are walking towards the brink of losing my trust. It's a gift I give you. I'm not going to tell you what to do because, again, my boundaries is like, I'm going to take action on what happens. It's not my job to police you.
Right.
It's your job to police yourself.
Yeah, it's a choice they're making. It's their choice, right?
Yes,
to change or not to change, or to understand it.
But you
to be
give
respectful
them the
of your
information.
Right.
The information, you have the grown-up conversation, and then you continue to trust but verify. But you're very, very upfront with those boundaries. You're very clear about how you're interpreting something. You're very clear about how it affected you. So this is why, for me, the trust freely has built into it a lot of really strong, positive connection, healthy relationship requirements versus the you have to earn my trust. That's a lot more of an avoidance, like a wait and see. It's a more passive approach. So you're not having to build simultaneously these other relationship muscles. And that's why I started thinking, is this contributing to the isolation and loneliness epidemic that we're having? Because it's not demanding of us to have all the concurrent healthy relationship skills that we need. Anyway, this is just my theory that I came up with this morning. Someone smarter than me can go and research it, but it's food for thought.
So what's interesting now is about context, right? It would seem like context would matter. So can you talk a little bit about how there's some contextual considerations?
Yeah, so I'm not saying that we should do this way or that way. There are just these differences, and context does matter. For example, by context, I mean, what's the surrounding situation? Is this a professional relationship or is this a personal relationship? And even in professional, is this a collaborative environment or is this a competitive environment? Because if I'm in a professional collaborative environment, then we share information. And is this a competitive environment? And it was interesting. In one organization, we had 4 different groups. My group within the larger group was collaborative. And so we are very open and we're collaborative, and these are some of my lifetime friends, this collaborative group that I was in. My office mate was in a different group. His was competitive. And what I observed, and we talked about this, is they would withhold information from each other. They didn't trust each other. They would get a nugget of marketing information, and instead of sharing it freely so everyone knew and could take advantage of it, they would hold it close to the breast.
So that's where their power is. That's the problem.
Yeah, because it was competitive.
Yeah, exactly.
So personal relationships, you have your closest sibling, whoever, your partner, you trust them. But say you've got the uncle who's, making crazy choices and they're being hurtful. And every time they show up to the holidays, they do the same hurtful thing over and over and over again. Well, yeah, I'm going to say, I'm not going to be open with Uncle so-and-so, because they've shown over and over again, like they're not earning my trust as being someone who creates a safe relationship with me. So yes, it's the context. What is the type of relationship? And then even within that context, you're like, is this a really close relationship or is this a distant relationship? There might be cultural aspects to it. There are cultures where you just hold things closer to the breast. You don't share unless you've been friends for a long time. Your past experience is one of the contexts. If you've had a past experience with a certain, say, salespeople, say you've had to buy a car a few times and you just never come away from that with a good experience, yeah, you're probably not going to trust. Just go to the next time you have to buy a car and freely trust that person.
Totally agree. Yeah, that happened to me. So exactly.
And then we talked about high stakes, low stakes. You do want to think about, it's a consequence, a high cost, or it's a consequence, a low cost, because that might adjust how you approach that particular, or is there a high benefit versus, there's not going to be a big benefit from doing this. So you want to think about these contexts and just to be more intentional about your approach. To me, from what I've seen, I don't know if this is something that gets instilled in us as a kid, because like I said, I was taught the opposite. My dad was distressed to hear that I give trust freely. So even if there was a message in my family, no, you have to earn it, that certainly didn't influence me. So this does seem to be somewhat an innate preference. So if that's true, then we're doing it in a knee-jerk way. And the reason we're having this conversation is we're inviting you just to be a little curious about yourself. Is it always serving me? Like, what is my style? What is my preference? Am I applying it across the board? Do I need to think of context? So that's why we're having this conversation.
And I think what's interesting too is, other than being fully one versus fully other, right? There is this whole thing about that option about the hybrid. And when we think a little bit about the hybrid, where there's a middle path, or or situational approach, like you talk about the context. We were just talking about this a little bit. Like I have a tendency, like you said, to trust more freely. But it is interesting based on when you talk about the context. I don't always do that. I just have a tendency. So I am using a hybrid approach, even though I never realized I was doing a hybrid approach. But when I think about it, it's interesting. And I think with trust these days, it is interesting about being more aware about where you are and what your tendency is and trying to think through to know yourself better, because it's about self-awareness. And so there is that whole benefit from the flexibility between these perspectives. Think about it, because if you can address and adjust your trust approach based on the unique dynamics of the individual in the relationship, because this is what you and I always talk about, is that relationships aren't the I, it, right? Mm-hmm. Where we categorize people. It's always about the I, thou, or I and you. It's the I and you and the difference between I and you. We need to adjust our trust approach based on that, because of that dynamic. So I like that idea of the adaptability to the different relationships.
Yeah, that it can be like this middle way is perhaps finding something that's a little bit more adaptable to different relationships. Again, maybe you're taking a cultural consideration that requires you to go outside your normal preference. So we adjust that trust approach in order to have more of a success in the relationship. We can do some risk management where we are thinking about those potential consequences and being intentional about what we choose, but also to develop risk resilience. So what I mean by risk resilience is that we take that risk to trust and then it doesn't work out. Now, if you haven't built resilience to say, well, I bounced back from it, it didn't work out this time, but I can still stay with this philosophy because 80% of the time it works out. That's resilience. But if you haven't cultivated risk resilience, that loss of trust can feel like a betrayal wound. And in a betrayal wound, that's what leads more towards those maladaptive, cautious, skeptical, cynical, defensive coping strategies because of that low resilience to the risk, difficulty bouncing back from the trust betrayal. So the more we develop our risk management and our risk resilience, the more flexibility we have to choose which approach is going to work best in a sort of hybrid situation. So, and also just as a psychologist, generally find that when there is this tendency to be either or, black or white, that leads to general overall less psychological resilience. And so we encourage building more cognitive flexibility, the ability to be in the question, to be in that middle way or the gray zone. And when we're talking about relationship development, this flexible approach, it really can evolve a little bit more naturally through that open communication. And it can help us avoid getting a bit rigid around this framework of all or nothing.
I do think, though, it's interesting about life stages. Does it shift with the age and maturity?
Not necessarily. Not necessarily. It really more can shift because you've done the work on it. Like, because I say that because if anything, does it change over the lifespan? It's possible that it gets worse because it's just more time to have those betrayal experiences.
Yeah, it's true. I never thought of it that way. It's true. Yeah.
But then I was also thinking about, there are a lot of seniors tend to be target of scams.
Yeah. Yeah.
So,
they tend to be trustworthy at first, but then they get target of scams. So they have this past betrayal and then it reshapes their trust. Because they go from trusting to not trusting anymore until they get that experience of learning how to build the trust again. I see that.
Yeah. So I'm not sure about the life stages, except for, like I said, it's like over time, if you've been betrayed a lot, then by the time you get your middle age, you're just like that. Everybody sucks.
And then what's interesting too, when you brought about the East-West Coast, because that's like moving between different communities, or you said earlier about workplaces, adjusting to those norms of the company, the cultures of the company. So there is that culture, context too. That's really cool. I'm so glad we did this topic, and I hope you guys are appreciating it too. It was just out of the blue. We were talking about that because we're talking about more about trust. And so we're getting close to the end. So Christine, do you want to recap for us?
Sure. So what we talked about is that people have different approaches to trust, and there seems to be either an unconscious quality to it or innate quality to it. Honestly, I've not done enough of the research to find out how much of this is temperament driven by our innate temperament, but there's pros and cons to each regardless of what your philosophy is. And so in building meaningful relationships, it really does help to make that philosophy transparent.
Mhm.
And to learn about what the pros and cons are so we can mitigate the negative aspects of each of the styles. And then starting to challenge yourself to have that maybe a balanced approach in certain situations rather than the either or.
Yeah.
Because the balanced approach, it can be based on the context, and there's ways to maintain the benefits of each of the philosophies in that balanced approach while mitigating the downsides of each of them, because actually they're opposites and they can balance each other out. So we want to challenge you to identify like what life experiences do you think shaped your philosophy, and are you being intentional, or is it an unconscious habit that you just didn't think about? I don't think I thought about it till someone noticed it in me and said, it wasn't a criticism. You're too naive. You're too trusting. And yet at that point in my life, I hadn't really experienced significant adverse consequences of being the way that I was. So I'd be like, oh, that's an interesting opinion. And started to see, oh, I guess everyone doesn't do this. Well, what do you do?
So I really like that, so these are some of the questions that you're asking our listeners to have. And so we'll put some more in our show notes for the full list of some listener reflection questions to ask. But Christina said the first one, which is understand your own trust orientation, right? And that's just notice is the whole point. We always believe in just noticing. And then there's that impact assessment. Like, can you recall an instance where your approach to trust led to an unexpected outcome, positive or negative? And who in your life approaches trust differently than you? After this discussion, I think Mark is opposite of me. I'm much more trustworthy, and I think he has people earn their trust. But he and I are going to have a discussion about that next time.
No, that's really cool.
Yeah. And then, for growth and adaptation, what is one small step you could take this week to create a healthier trust dynamic in an important relationship, right? So then you're not just one or the other, that you're actually having that more moving along that based on the context or something. But realize this is an important relationship, and how do you want to have that? And for those people who are leaders or managers, how might your personal trust orientation influence your team culture? Because, that's that whole thing about, oh, my manager is so naive. She trusts everybody, right? Or the whole
point they're so guarded. Or they're so guarded. I don't know.
Yeah, and they're like, he doesn't trust me, right? And oh my gosh, I can't do anything right. Yeah. And, I think it's also the importance of the mental health things, is recognizing that trust issues might be the core of my relationship difficulties. Or how can you develop greater trust flexibility to enhance your effectiveness in your professional role?
Yeah, so again, we just notes, folks.
Yeah. And we just want to thank you for joining us, right, on today's topic, because I just love today's topic. And we'd love for you to actually share your perspective, hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, forward to those other people. And then maybe, your friends that you actually forwarded to, have that discussion about what their trust experience is, what's their orientation, and just talk it through.
Yeah, that's a great idea. And thank you, everybody, again for listening. And until next week, stay curious, stay kind, and we'll see you next week.